Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into a landscape that spent centuries arguing with water. Not loudly, of course. The Dutch preferred to negotiate with the sea using shovels, dikes, canals, and eventually enormous windmills that looked as if they had politely asked the wind to become an employee. So, if you're settling into bed, fluff your pillow a little, dim the lights, and allow your thoughts to slow down like an old canal boat carrying far too much cheese. As always, if you enjoy these sleepy journeys through history, consider liking the video and subscribing for more wonderfully uneventful adventures into humanity's longest and slowest projects. Tonight's story isn't really about war. It isn't about kings charging into battle. Nobody discovers a magical treasure. Instead, we're spending the next little while watching generations of ordinary people attempt the remarkably ambitious task of convincing Marshes that they would rather become farmland. As impossible life goals go, it ranks surprisingly high. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine standing somewhere in what is now the Netherlands, nearly 1,000 years ago. You don't see endless fields of tulips. You don't hear bicycles. There isn't a postcard windmill turning gracefully in the distance. Instead, water, more water, then slightly wetter water. The land stretches away beneath an endless gray sky, broken only by reeds, pools, peat bogs, and shallow lakes reflecting slow-moving clouds. Every step sinks into damp earth. Boots disappear into mud with the kind of determination usually reserved for taxes. The air smells of wet grass, salt carried inland from the North Sea, and decaying plants that have been quietly turning into peat for thousands of years. It's peaceful, mostly, until your foot disappears. Again, the Netherlands wasn't always the carefully engineered country we know today. Long before neat canals divided the countryside into geometric patterns, nature was largely in charge. Rivers wandered wherever they pleased. Storm tides flooded entire regions. Marshes shifted with every season. Peat bogs slowly rose and fell, like giant soggy mattresses nobody had asked to sleep on. The people who settled here weren't conquering nature. They were renting tiny pieces of it under extremely unstable terms and conditions. Every village understood one uncomfortable truth. The water could always come back. Sometimes it arrived gently. Sometimes it arrived at 3 o'clock in the morning with hurricane-force winds and absolutely no interest in polite conversation. Living here demanded patience, an incredible amount of patience. Farmers couldn't simply plow wherever they wanted. Builders couldn't just place houses anywhere that looked convenient. One careless decision could leave an entire home slowly sinking into soft ground over several decades, which, admittedly, is an unusually slow way for a construction project to fail. The earliest inhabitants adapted rather than resisted. Archaeological evidence suggests that people living in these wetlands built homes on raised mounds called turpen, artificial hills carefully constructed from clay, sand, manure, and whatever else could keep family members slightly farther away from incoming floodwater. Imagine spending years building your home, then spending even more years building the hill underneath it. This wasn't glamorous engineering. It was survival. Entire communities cooperated because no individual family possessed enough labor to reshape the landscape alone. Neighbors became partners, not merely because they enjoyed each other's company, but because refusing to help today might mean drowning together tomorrow. Even before written laws developed, cooperation became almost sacred. Water ignored property lines. Floods did not care who won last year's village argument. Everyone either maintained the dikes together or watched them fail together. It's surprisingly difficult to hold a grudge while desperately stacking sandbags beside the person who borrowed your goat 3 winters ago. As centuries passed, more settlers arrived. The marshes held hidden opportunities. Fish filled winding waterways. Waterfowl nested in great numbers. Peat provided valuable fuel. Reeds supplied roofing material. Cattle grazed on patches of higher ground. To outsiders, the landscape appeared harsh. To local families, it simply represented home. A difficult home. A damp home. A home where your shoes rarely became completely dry, but home nonetheless. The seasons ruled daily life. Spring brought swelling rivers, carrying meltwater from distant lands. Summer offered brief periods of warmth and easier travel. Autumn soaked everything once again. Winter occasionally froze canals into shimmering highways that connected isolated settlements. When ice arrived, people could suddenly travel in directions impossible during warmer months. The same marsh that trapped travelers in July became a frozen road by January. Nature was wonderfully inconsistent. The medieval Dutch simply learned to schedule around her moods. Of course, medieval weather forecasts were not especially reliable. You couldn't check an app. There wasn't a cheerful television presenter pointing toward suspicious-looking clouds. Instead, villagers watched birds. They studied winds. They noticed changes in tides, and occasionally they guessed. Sometimes correctly, sometimes spectacularly incorrectly. Religion also shaped how people understood this unpredictable environment. Many believed floods reflected divine judgment or reminders of human humility. Church bells echoed across wetlands, calling communities together not only for worship, but for mutual support during disasters. Faith and engineering slowly became companions. One encouraged hope, the other encouraged digging. Both proved useful. The political landscape was almost as complicated as the physical one. Small lordships controlled scattered territories. Bishops possessed significant influence. Counts negotiated shifting alliances. Villages often found themselves balancing obligations to local nobles, while simultaneously maintaining the infrastructure necessary for survival. If taxes weren't collected, someone became angry. If dikes weren't repaired, everyone became wet. One problem generally attracted stronger motivation. Trade gradually expanded. Boats moved goods through rivers and shallow waterways far more efficiently than wagons struggled across muddy tracks. Markets connected isolated communities. Fish.cheese, timber, salt, peat.wool. Everything traveled by water. Ironically, the same waterways threatening villages also allowed prosperity to grow. People adapted not by eliminating water, but by learning to cooperate with it. For now, because eventually, cooperation alone would no longer be enough. As populations increased during the High Middle Ages, more land became necessary. Families expanded, villages grew, food demands increased. Unfortunately, marshes remained stubbornly committed to being marshes. Fields suitable for farming were limited. Every generation looked across nearby wetlands and imagined possibilities, if only. Those two words have inspired some of humanity's greatest engineering achievements. They've also inspired countless questionable decisions. Fortunately for Dutch history, this particular if only eventually produced remarkable results, but not immediately. The first attempts at reclaiming land relied almost entirely upon muscle power. Workers dug drainage channels using wooden spades. Communities raised primitive embankments. Canals diverted excess water toward rivers. Everything required endless labor. There were no engines, no bulldozers, no diesel pumps, only determined people, carrying dirt one basket at a time. History sometimes celebrates brilliant inventors. Less frequently does it celebrate thousands of anonymous laborers who collectively moved millions of cubic meters of earth, using little more than persistence and sore backs. Those workers deserve quiet admiration, preferably while sitting comfortably rather than digging. One particularly fascinating challenge involved peat itself. Peat accumulated over thousands of years from partially decayed vegetation. People cut blocks of peat for fuel, drying them before burning. This provided valuable energy during cold winters. But removing peat created another problem. The land surface slowly lowered. Lower land invited more flooding, which required additional drainage, which demanded even more effort. History occasionally resembles someone trying to empty a bathtub while simultaneously drilling holes in the bottom. Nobody intended this cycle, yet it unfolded over generations. Children inherited landscapes subtly different from those of their grandparents. Tiny changes accumulated. Water slowly gained advantages. Communities searched for better solutions. At this point in our story, you may wonder where the famous Dutch windmills have gone. An understandable question. After all, they are featured in tonight's title. For the moment, though, they remain somewhere in history's waiting room. Their great sails have not yet appeared above the reeds. Their gears have not yet begun turning. The marshes still dominate. The wind still passes across open water, largely unnoticed. Nature possesses abundant energy. Humans simply haven't figured out the most efficient way to borrow it. Yet, that discovery will come. And when it does, it won't happen overnight. There won't be a dramatic movie montage, no triumphant orchestra, no inventor running into the village shouting, "I've solved everything." History is almost never that considerate. Instead, ideas drift slowly between regions. Knowledge spreads through merchants, monks, craftsmen, and travelers. One village experiments, another copies. Someone improves the design. Someone else accidentally makes it worse. Progress wanders forward at a leisurely pace, much like an elderly cow crossing a muddy pasture while ignoring everyone's schedule. The Dutch landscape itself encouraged patience. Nothing here changed quickly. Rivers carved new channels over decades. Peat accumulated over centuries. Storms reshaped coastlines over generations. Human engineering would likewise become a long conversation between people and nature, rather than a sudden victory. If the marshes taught anything, they taught humility. You could build a dike. The sea might remove it. You could drain a field. Heavy rain might reclaim it. You could spend 20 years improving farmland. only for one catastrophic flood to remind everyone that nature still possessed seniority. Perhaps that's why Dutch communities developed such remarkable resilience. Failure wasn't always permanent. Repairs began almost immediately. Neighbors gathered. Earth was moved again. Canals reopened. Life continued. Because there really wasn't another option. Leave the marshes unattended for too long, and they would happily resume their previous occupation. Being marshes, as evening settles across this ancient landscape, mist begins rising from still water. Frogs call softly among reeds. A distant church bell echoes through damp air. Smoke curls from simple cottages built upon precious patches of higher ground. Families gather around fires, fueled with carefully cut peat. Outside, unseen beneath the growing darkness, countless channels carry water silently toward rivers and the sea. The wind drifts across the wetlands with patient indifference, for now it is simply another feature of the landscape, invisible, untamed, waiting. Neither the villagers nor their children can fully imagine that one day this same wind will become one of the greatest partners in reshaping their world. But that story belongs to tomorrow, and in our next chapter, the first wooden windmills will begin their slow journey into Dutch history, turning gentle breezes into tireless labor, and quietly transforming one of Europe's wettest landscapes into one of its greatest engineering achievements. Part 2. Why the Dutch needed windmills. If you happened to fall asleep somewhere among the reeds at the end of our last chapter, don't worry. The marshes have been waiting patiently for hundreds of years already. They can certainly wait another few seconds while you get comfortable. Tonight, we continue our slow journey through the soggy heart of the medieval Netherlands, a place where the ground was never entirely trustworthy and where water possessed an almost annoying amount of confidence. Imagine waking just before sunrise. The mist still hangs low over the canals. A fisherman quietly pushes his flat-bottomed boat away from a muddy bank. A dairy farmer walks carefully across damp pasture, hoping his cows have remained on the correct side of the drainage ditch during the night. Somewhere nearby, someone is already repairing a section of embankment that yesterday seemed perfectly fine. That, more or less, was life. The people living here were not trying to become great engineers. They simply wanted dry feet often enough to grow food. History has a habit of making enormous achievements look inevitable. Looking backward, it's easy to say, well, of course the Dutch built windmills, but nothing about it was obvious. For centuries, they solved problems the only way anyone could, with muscles and a remarkable willingness to repeat the same exhausting task every single day. Every ditch had to be dug by hand. Every embankment had to be raised basket by basket. Every collapsed bank had to be rebuilt after storms. There was no magical machine waiting around the corner, only determined villagers and a seemingly endless supply of mud. The greatest challenge was not simply that there was water. There had always been water. The problem was that there was gradually becoming more water in places where people desperately wanted less of it. One reason was population. Between the 10th and 13th centuries, the Low Countries experienced steady growth. Villages expanded. Families became larger. Markets flourished. More mouths required more bread. More bread required more grain. More grain required more farmland. Unfortunately, marshes rarely volunteer to become wheat fields. Left alone, they much preferred supporting frogs. Entire communities began pushing farther into wetlands that earlier generations had wisely avoided. Forests were cleared, peat bogs were drained, canals stretched into places where only birds and reeds had previously lived. At first, the results seemed encouraging. Fresh land appeared, fields produced crops, livestock grazed on newly reclaimed pasture. For a while, it looked as though humanity might actually be winning its polite disagreement with nature. Nature, however, had simply been waiting for the second half of the conversation. One of the most valuable resources hidden beneath the marshes was peat. At first glance, peat doesn't appear particularly exciting. It looks like dark, damp earth, hardly the sort of thing poets usually celebrate. Yet medieval families depended on it. After being cut into blocks and dried, peat burned surprisingly well. In a country with relatively few forests, it became one of the primary fuels for cooking, heating homes, baking bread, firing pottery, and warming churches during long northern winters. Entire industries developed around digging it. Workers carefully sliced rectangular blocks from the bogs. They stacked them in neat rows beneath the open sky. Weeks later, after drying, wagons and boats carried the fuel toward nearby towns. It was slow work, cold work, very muddy work. By now you've probably noticed that almost every occupation in medieval Holland involved getting muddy. That wasn't a coincidence. The mud was remarkably committed to participating in everyone's career. Yet every block of peat removed created an invisible problem. The ground slowly became lower. At first, nobody noticed much difference. A few centimeters here, another few centimeters there. Years passed, then decades. Eventually, entire landscapes sat noticeably lower than before. Lower land meant rainwater lingered longer. Rivers spilled more easily across fields. Storm tides reached farther inland. The same fuel that kept homes warm quietly increased the danger outside their doors. History occasionally enjoys charging interest on practical decisions. Water, meanwhile, remained wonderfully persistent. Rain fell during autumn. Snow melted every spring. Rivers carried enormous volumes of water from Germany, Belgium, and France before emptying into the North Sea. The Rhine, the Meuse, the Ijssel. Together, they delivered not only commerce, but constant pressure whenever heavy rains occurred upstream. Dutch villages often discovered the consequences days later. It hardly seemed fair. Imagine your fields flooding because someone several hundred kilometers away had unusually bad weather. Nature rarely consults local governments. Then there was the sea. The North Sea has never developed a reputation for kindness. Even on calm days, it commands respect. During powerful storms, it could become terrifying. Strong northwesterly winds pushed seawater against the coast with enormous force. High tides rose even higher. Dikes trembled beneath relentless waves. Occasionally they failed. When that happened, seawater rushed inland with astonishing speed. Entire villages disappeared beneath gray, churning water. Livestock drowned. Homes collapsed. Fields became coated with salt, making farming difficult for years afterward. Church records describe disasters with heartbreaking simplicity. families lost, harvests destroyed, communities forced to begin again. No dramatic speeches, just quiet determination. People rebuilt because there was nowhere else to go. They repaired the same dikes, reopened the same canals, replanted the same fields, and hoped the next storm might choose someone else. Hope, while admirable, was not an engineering strategy. The Dutch needed something more dependable. Until then, drainage depended largely on gravity. If a canal could be dug from higher land toward lower water, excess water slowly flowed away on its own. Gravity is wonderfully reliable. It never requests payment. It never takes holidays. Unfortunately, gravity also refuses to move water uphill. That became the central problem. As reclaimed land gradually sank below the level of nearby rivers and canals, water could no longer escape naturally. Instead, it simply collected. Fields remained soaked. Roads disappeared beneath standing water. Pastures became marshes once again. Farmers watched months of labor vanish beneath shallow pools. Someone eventually had to ask the obvious question: what if we lifted the water instead? Simple question, extremely complicated answer. For a while, people relied on buckets, lots of buckets. Teams of workers passed water from one level to another. Animals turned primitive lifting devices. Small scoop wheels moved modest amounts of water. These methods worked up to a point. But imagine trying to empty an entire lake using wooden buckets. Eventually, enthusiasm begins to fade. Horses helped, oxen helped, people helped, yet even the strongest workers became tired. Animals required food. Labor cost money. Water, by comparison, never seemed to grow exhausted. It simply waited for everyone else to stop. Meanwhile, another force crossed the landscape every single day without asking for wages: the wind. The coastal plains of the Netherlands are famously windy. Anyone visiting today quickly understands why cyclists often appear to be engaged in deeply personal arguments with invisible air. Those same steady breezes existed 1,000 years ago, long before modern weather stations measured average wind speeds. Medieval people already understood something important. The wind was dependable, not constant, but dependable enough. For generations, it had filled the sails of merchant ships. Fishing boats relied upon it. Travelers learned to respect it. The question slowly emerged: if the wind could move ships, could it move machines? The idea itself wasn't entirely new. Wind-powered machines already existed elsewhere in Europe. By the 12th century, windmills had begun appearing in England, northern France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire. Most of these early mills had a relatively straightforward purpose: grinding grain. Farmers carried sacks of wheat to local mills. The rotating sails turned heavy wooden gears. Those gears rotated enormous millstones. Hours of exhausting manual labor suddenly became far easier. The wind cheerfully accepted the difficult work. It never complained about overtime. It rarely requested lunch breaks. Admittedly, it occasionally disappeared without notice. But overall, it was an excellent employee. Dutch craftsmen observed these machines with growing curiosity. Merchants traveled. Monks exchanged ideas. Builders learned from neighboring regions. Knowledge spread slowly along the same trade routes that carried wool, timber, salt, and cheese. Someone eventually wondered, whether the principle could solve an entirely different problem, not grinding grain, moving water. That small shift in thinking would eventually transform the country. Of course, imagining such a machine proved much easier than constructing one. A grain mill only needed to rotate millstones. A drainage mill required lifting thousands upon thousands of liters of water every hour, often for days at a time. Its gears had to be stronger, its foundations more stable, its moving parts more reliable. Everything had to survive relentless wind, rain, damp air, and shifting soil. The Marshes were demanding customers. Fortunately, Dutch carpenters possessed extraordinary skill. Wood shaped nearly every aspect of medieval life: homes, bridges, ships, locks, canal, gates, fishing boats, and now, increasingly ambitious machinery. Oak forests supplied massive beams. Elm resisted moisture. Ash provided flexibility where needed. Every timber had a purpose. Master builders studied trees, almost the way physicians studied patients. They knew which trunks twisted, which split, which endured decades of harsh weather. Without that accumulated knowledge, the great drainage mills could never have existed. But before the first pumping windmills rose above the reeds, there remained years of experimentation. Some designs failed. Others required constant repairs. Gears cracked, axles warped, foundations shifted. Progress arrived, one careful improvement at a time. No single inventor deserves all the credit. Instead, generations of anonymous craftsmen quietly refined ideas until they finally worked well enough to change history. As twilight settles once more across the marshes, the wind continues its endless journey over reeds and shallow water. For centuries, people heard only its whistle through the grass. Soon, they will hear something entirely different: the creaking of giant wooden sails, the steady groan of gears, the rhythmic splash of water being lifted from low fields into higher canals. The wind itself is about to become a laborer, and in the next chapter, we will meet the remarkable wooden structures that made that transformation possible. The first Dutch windmills, standing patiently against the sky, ready to begin one of history's slowest and most extraordinary engineering revolutions. Part 3. Building the first wooden windmills. The evening breeze has finally found a purpose. For thousands of years, it wandered across the Dutch marshes with complete freedom. It bent reeds, rippled ponds, scattered clouds, and occasionally ruined someone's freshly hung laundry. Beyond that, it had very little to do. Now, as we continue our quiet journey through medieval Holland, that same wind is about to begin one of the longest careers in engineering history. Get comfortable once again. The fire inside the farmhouse burns low. Outside, somewhere beyond the drainage ditches, an owl calls into the darkness. Morning is still several hours away, but a handful of craftsmen are already awake, quietly discussing pieces of timber stacked beside a canal. None of them realize that the structures they are preparing to build will become symbols recognized around the world centuries later. To them, this is simply another construction project. A difficult one, perhaps a slightly confusing one, and certainly one that involves an unreasonable amount of wood. Unlike castles or cathedrals, the earliest Dutch windmills were never built to impress anyone. They were tools, large, expensive, wonderfully complicated tools. Every beam, peg, gear, and joint existed for one purpose: turning the invisible force of the wind into useful work. That may sound obvious today. To a medieval carpenter, however, it bordered on astonishing. Imagine explaining the concept to someone who had never seen such a machine. So, you're telling me this building has arms? Yes. And those arms spin. Hopefully. And somehow spinning wooden arms can empty a flooded field? That's the plan. There would probably be a very long silence after that, perhaps followed by cautious nodding, or someone quietly wondering whether the village blacksmith had been breathing too much charcoal smoke. The idea itself had traveled across Europe over many generations. Wind-powered grain mills had already appeared in parts of England and northern France. Traveling merchants described them. Monks copied sketches. Builders exchanged ideas. Knowledge rarely moved quickly during the Middle Ages. Instead, it drifted from town to town like pollen on a spring breeze. A carpenter might spend several months working in another province before returning home with unfamiliar construction techniques. A merchant could describe an unusual machine he had seen hundreds of kilometers away. A nobleman visiting another territory might commission something similar upon returning. No internet, no engineering journals, no instructional videos. Titled, Top 5 Mistakes You're Making While Constructing a Medieval Windmill. Ideas simply traveled with people, slowly, patiently, occasionally becoming slightly exaggerated during the journey. Dutch craftsmen soon recognized that ordinary grain mills would not completely solve their problems. Grinding flour required steady rotational force. Draining wetlands demanded something entirely different. Water had weight, a tremendous amount of weight. Moving thousands of liters every hour required stronger frames, heavier gears, and far more durable foundations. The machine itself needed to survive constant vibration while standing on ground that wasn't especially interested in supporting heavy objects. The Marshes had many admirable qualities. Solid foundations were not among them. Before construction could even begin, builders searched for suitable locations. Choosing the wrong site could doom the entire project. The mill required exposure to steady winds. Nearby trees could disrupt airflow. Hills, rare though they were, might block important gusts. Buildings created turbulence. Even neighboring barns could reduce efficiency. Fortunately, the Netherlands possessed one tremendous advantage. It was astonishingly flat. From an engineering perspective, flat landscapes are wonderfully cooperative. Wind arrives with relatively few obstacles. It sweeps across rivers, lakes, and marshes almost uninterrupted. That dependable airflow would eventually become one of the nation's greatest natural resources, although, at the time, most villagers simply described it as rather windy. Once the location had been chosen, another challenge immediately appeared. Timber, a great deal of timber. The earliest post mills, among the first common windmill designs in Northern Europe, were almost entirely constructed from wood. Massive oak beams formed the central framework. Oak was valued because of its remarkable strength and durability. A mature oak tree represented decades, sometimes centuries, of slow growth. Cutting one down was never a casual decision. Forests throughout medieval Europe were carefully managed. Local lords often controlled valuable woodland, villages required permission to harvest certain trees. Timber wasn't simply lying around waiting to become machinery. Every large beam represented labor, planning, transportation, and considerable expense. After the trees were felled, they could not immediately become building materials. Fresh timber contained enormous amounts of moisture. Wood shrinks as it dries. If builders hurried the process, beams might twist, crack, or warp. Patience once again became an essential engineering tool. Logs rested for months, sometimes longer. Rain washed over them. Sunlight slowly dried them. Carpenters inspected each piece repeatedly. Only after sufficient seasoning could the real work begin. Modern construction projects often complain about delays measured in weeks. Medieval builders occasionally waited an entire year before even beginning. The marshes weren't going anywhere. Neither was the wind. Now imagine entering a carpenter's workshop around the year 1200. The smell is unforgettable. Fresh-cut oak, pine resin, wood shavings covering the floor, linseed oil, beeswax, smoke drifting from a nearby forge. Everywhere you look, craftsmen are shaping beams with broad axes, long-handled adzes smooth rough surfaces. Hand saws move steadily through thick timber. Wooden mallets echo rhythmically. Metal chisels carve deep mortises into massive posts. The workshop hums with quiet concentration. Nobody rushes. Precision matters far more than speed. One poorly cut joint might weaken the entire structure. Unlike modern buildings, these windmills relied remarkably little on iron nails. Instead, carpenters perfected wooden joinery. Mortise and tenon joints locked beams together. Hardwood pegs secured them firmly. Diagonal braces distributed enormous loads throughout the frame. Many of these techniques had been refined over generations while building ships and timber-framed houses. Dutch carpenters simply adapted familiar skills to an entirely new machine. At the heart of every early post mill stood its most remarkable feature, the massive central post. This single vertical beam supported nearly the entire weight of the windmill. Everything above it, including the machinery, walls, roof, sails, and gears, could rotate around that central support. It was an elegant solution, simple in theory, extremely demanding in practice. That post needed extraordinary strength. It carried tremendous loads while enduring constant movement. Any weakness could prove disastrous. Builders therefore selected only the finest oak trunks, straight, dense, free from major defects. Some measured more than 2 feet across. Standing beside one must have inspired both admiration and mild concern. So, yes, we're balancing an entire building on that? Exactly. And we're expecting it to spin? Correct. I'll admit, that's ambitious. The rotating body of the mill allowed millers to face the sails toward changing winds, unlike later tower mills, which rotated only their caps. Early post mills required the entire wooden structure to turn. This wasn't accomplished by magic, nor by dozens of exhausted villagers pushing random walls. Instead, long wooden beams extended from the rear of the mill. Using these beams, workers carefully rotated the building until the sails aligned with favorable winds. Slowly, patiently, very carefully, it resembled persuading an exceptionally stubborn giant to change chairs. Every moving part demanded careful craftsmanship. Large wooden gears transferred rotational energy. Smaller gears altered speed. Axles carried tremendous loads. Bearings required regular lubrication using animal fat or vegetable oils. Without proper maintenance, friction quickly destroyed expensive components. Millwrights, specialized craftsmen who built and repaired mills, soon became highly respected professionals. Their work combined carpentry, mathematics, mechanics, and years of practical experience. A good millwright could transform an ordinary village. A poor one could produce an extraordinarily expensive collection of stationary timber. Communities quickly learned the difference. As the framework rose higher above the marshes, curious villagers gathered nearby. Children pointed excitedly. Farmers paused during their work. Travelers stopped to watch. The unfinished structure already looked unlike anything most had ever seen. Towering timbers stretched into the sky. Scaffolding surrounded the growing frame. Ropes dangled from temporary lifting devices. Men balanced confidently along beams that would make modern safety inspectors immediately reconsider their careers. Every large component had to be lifted using human strength, wooden cranes, block and tackle systems, and remarkable teamwork. No steam engines, no hydraulic lifts, only gravity, leverage, ropes, and determination. It was slow work, but then again, almost everything worthwhile in medieval Holland seemed to require moving slowly. As the first sails were finally assembled and raised into place, the villagers stood silently, watching the great wooden arms extend outward for the very first time. The breeze caught the canvas almost gently, not enough to begin turning, just enough to make the fabric ripple, almost as though the wind itself was examining its newest companion. The real test was still to come. Soon, the craftsmen would discover whether months of careful planning, patient carpentry, and extraordinary effort had created merely an impressive wooden building or the beginning of a machine capable of changing an entire nation. And in the next chapter, those great sails will finally begin to turn as the first drainage windmills attempt something no machine had ever accomplished on such a scale, lifting water from the marshes and slowly giving new land back to the people who had dreamed of reclaiming it for generations. Part 4. Draining the marshes. One rotation at a time morning arrives quietly across the Dutch marshes, not with dramatic sunrises or brilliant colors, but with a pale silver light that slowly spreads across the canals. Mist drifts lazily above the water. Ducks leave delicate ripples behind them. And somewhere in the distance, a church bell announces another ordinary day. Except today is not entirely ordinary. For the first time, one of the newly built wooden windmills is ready to work. Months of planning, thousands of carefully shaped pieces of timber, hundreds of wooden pegs, miles of rope, an astonishing number of splinters. Everything has led to this single moment. A handful of villagers gather outside the mill shortly after dawn. Some are hopeful, others are skeptical. One elderly farmer crosses his arms and quietly mutters that he still trusts a good shovel more than a giant spinning building. History has always had room for healthy skepticism. especially when someone suggests solving a centuries-old problem by attaching enormous wooden sails to what is essentially a very complicated shed. The millwright walks slowly around the structure one final time. He places a weathered hand against the central post, checks each wooden brace, inspects the sailcloth, touches the great oak gears hidden inside. He has probably done this several dozen times already, but today feels different. Today the wind itself becomes his partner. A gentle breeze begins sweeping across the flat countryside. The large canvas-covered sails shiver almost imperceptibly. Then, one sail moves only a few inches. The movement is so slight that several villagers wonder whether they imagined it. Another breeze follows. This time the great arms rotate farther. The massive wooden cross slowly turns against the brightening sky. The first complete revolution takes nearly a full minute. Nobody cheers. Nobody shouts. Instead, everyone watches in complete silence because they are witnessing something almost magical. Not magic, of course. Engineering. But good engineering often looks suspiciously like magic until someone patiently explains the gears. Inside the mill, enormous oak cogs begin engaging one another with a deep, rhythmic clunk. Wood rubs against wood. Greased bearings groan softly. The main shaft turns with deliberate confidence. Each revolution transfers energy deeper into the machine, downward, toward the heart of the mill, toward the water. Unlike grain mills, whose power disappeared into heavy millstones, drainage mills directed their energy into lifting water itself. The earliest Dutch drainage mills often used a simple but ingenious mechanism known as the scoop wheel. Imagine an enormous wooden wheel positioned partly inside a drainage canal. Around its rim are broad wooden paddles. As the wheel slowly rotates, each paddle scoops water upward before spilling it into a higher channel. Simple, reliable, remarkably effective, at least when compared with asking 20 exhausted laborers to carry buckets all afternoon. The scoop wheel begins moving, at first almost reluctantly. Its heavy wooden frame creaks beneath years of careful craftsmanship. Compressed into a single moment, water splashes gently as the lowest paddles disappear beneath the canal's surface. Another quarter turn, another splash. Then something extraordinary begins happening. Water starts climbing, not flowing naturally downhill, as it always had, but rising. One paddle lifts, then another. A steady stream pours into the higher drainage ditch with a satisfying rush. The villagers exchange uncertain glances. It is working, slowly, patiently, but undeniably working. The mill is doing exactly what generations had hoped might be possible. It is lifting water using nothing more than wind. No horses, no oxen, no teams of laborers. Only invisible air moving across giant wooden sails. The skeptical farmer quietly scratches his beard. He says nothing, which, in villages everywhere throughout history, has often been the closest thing to admitting someone else was right. The mill continues turning. Hour after hour, the breeze remains steady throughout the morning. Water that had lingered in low fields for weeks begins making its slow journey toward larger canals. Children quickly become fascinated. They sit beside drainage channels watching floating leaves travel farther than they ever had before. To them, The changing water seems almost alive. Adults notice something even more important. The soil begins drying. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually enough that boots sink a little less deeply into the earth. The difference is subtle. History often changes quietly before anyone realizes it has changed at all. By midday, farmers are already discussing fields that may finally become suitable for crops. Land that had remained too wet for generations suddenly appears full of possibility. One successful mill cannot transform an entire province, but it can transform expectations. And expectations are powerful things. Word travels surprisingly quickly through medieval Holland. Traveling merchants carry news between towns. Monks mention unusual machines in distant monasteries. Boat captains describe strange, rotating buildings standing beside canals. Within months, neighboring villages begin arriving to see the mill for themselves. Some come out of curiosity, others come with notebooks. Well, the medieval equivalent of notebooks, mostly wax tablets and careful memories. A village elder walks slowly around the machine, studying every beam. A carpenter crouches beside the gears, quietly counting teeth on each wooden wheel. A local lord calculates something entirely different: money. If one windmill can reclaim several hectares of farmland, how much additional rent might those fields eventually produce? History's greatest inventions rarely remain purely scientific achievements for long. Sooner or later, someone begins calculating profits. Not everyone welcomes these enormous machines. Some villagers fear they are unnatural. Others worry that replacing human labor with machinery will reduce employment. Millers who grind grain occasionally wonder whether these new drainage mills will somehow threaten their own livelihoods. Change, even beneficial change, almost always arrives carrying a few anxious questions. Fortunately, draining water creates more work than it replaces. New farmland requires farmers. New canals require maintenance. New dikes demand repairs. Villages expand. Livestock increases. Markets grow. Rather than replacing communities, the windmills allow communities to become larger. As more drainage mills appear across the countryside, something remarkable begins happening to the landscape itself. Areas that had once been shallow lakes begin shrinking. Reeds retreat farther from newly dug fields. Pastures emerge where fishermen once cast their nets. Roads become easier to travel. Homes are built upon ground previously considered impossible. Generation after generation witnesses subtle changes. A grandfather remembers catching fish where his grandson now grazes cattle. Neither memory is wrong. The land itself has simply changed, slowly enough that nobody notices, from one season to the next, quickly enough that everyone notices after 50 years. Maintaining these mills becomes a profession in itself. The wind, dependable though it is, possesses an occasionally mischievous personality. Strong storms threaten to overspeed the sails. Calm summer days leave them motionless. Heavy rain increases the amount of water needing removal precisely when clouds reduce visibility for repairs. Millers must constantly adapt. A good drainage miller becomes part engineer, part weather observer, part carpenter, and part philosopher. He rises before sunrise, studies the clouds, tests the wind with practiced eyes, listens to the rhythm of wooden gears. A subtle creak may indicate a loose brace. A different vibration suggests worn bearings. An unusual splash below could mean debris caught in the scoop wheel. Every sound tells a story. The mill speaks constantly. Experienced millers simply learn its language. Daily maintenance never truly ends. Canvas sails require patching. Wood swells during damp weather and shrinks during dry summers. Oak pegs loosen. Ropes fray. Birds occasionally decide the machinery provides excellent nesting opportunities. Birds, unfortunately, rarely appreciate engineering schedules. Neither do mice. Both become frequent and rather unhelpful tenants. Winter presents an entirely new challenge. Ice forms inside canals. Water becomes sluggish. Occasionally, the scoop wheel freezes into place overnight. Millers rise before dawn, carrying axes and wooden mallets, carefully breaking ice away from the machinery before the morning wind strengthens. Cold fingers, frozen boots. And yet the work continues, because water never truly rests. If the mill stops for too long, the marsh begins quietly reclaiming everything. The relationship between people and nature remains less like a victory and more like an endless negotiation. Each rotation of the sails represents another sentence in that conversation. The wind offers its strength. The mill accepts. The water reluctantly moves aside. The people gain another small piece of dry land. No one expects perfection, only progress, and progress, measured one careful revolution at a time, proves more than enough. As evening approaches once again, the sails continue their slow rhythm against the orange sky. The great wooden machine seems almost alive now, breathing with every passing breeze. The villagers no longer stare in disbelief. Instead, they walk past it on their way home, quietly accepting that this remarkable invention has become part of everyday life. Soon, however, these solitary windmills will no longer stand alone. Entire networks of drainage mills will begin working together, linked by canals, dikes, and ingenious engineering, reclaiming vast stretches of land that once belonged only to water. That is where our story will continue in the next chapter, as ordinary villages learn an extraordinary lesson. One windmill can drain a field, but many windmills, working together, can reshape an entire nation. Part 5. Millers, Families, and Lonely Lives by now. The great wooden sails have become a familiar sight against the Dutch sky. Morning after morning, they turn with quiet determination, lifting water from low fields into higher canals, one steady rotation after another. The marshes are changing, almost too slowly to notice, but changing nonetheless. Tonight, though, we're leaving the machinery behind for a while, because every windmill, no matter how clever its gears or how graceful its sails, depended on one rather important piece of equipment: a human being, specifically the miller. History has a curious habit of remembering impressive buildings while forgetting the people who spent their entire lives inside them. Visitors admire castles. They photograph cathedrals. They sketch old windmills standing peacefully beside canals. Far fewer stop to wonder who climbed those narrow wooden stairs every morning for 40 years, or who repaired broken gears during winter storms, or who listened to the same creaking timbers every night until those sounds became as familiar as their own heartbeat. The miller lived with the machine, quite literally. Many drainage windmills included modest living quarters tucked beneath or beside the machinery. They were practical rather than luxurious. The walls were thick enough to keep out most of the wind. Most of it. The roof leaked occasionally. The windows were small. The rooms were simple. A fireplace occupied the center of family life. A rough wooden table served for meals, repairs, bookkeeping, and sometimes school lessons for the children. Nobody would have mistaken it for a royal palace unless royalty had suddenly developed a surprising enthusiasm for damp boots and perpetual drafts. The day usually began well before sunrise. A good miller learned that the wind rarely consulted comfortable sleeping schedules. If a strong breeze arrived before dawn, the sails needed to be ready. If a storm threatened, they needed securing. The weather dictated nearly everything. Long before clocks became common household possessions, experienced millers measured time by entirely different signs: the color of the eastern sky, the calls of birds, the smell of approaching rain, the direction of the wind brushing across nearby reeds. Nature provided a remarkably accurate schedule, provided one knew how to read it. The first task each morning was inspection. No matter how reliable the windmill had been yesterday, today demanded another careful examination. The sails, the canvas, the brake, the gears, the bearings, the scoop wheel, the drainage channels. Everything received attention. Wood has many admirable qualities. Predictability is not always one of them. A beam could swell after days of rain. A peg might loosen overnight. A gear tooth could crack under constant strain. Tiny problems ignored today often became expensive disasters tomorrow. So the miller climbed every day up steep ladders, polished smooth by generations of boots. The smell of oak surrounded him. Grease clung to the machinery. Dust floated through narrow shafts of morning sunlight. Outside, the countryside stretched endlessly across flat fields and winding canals. Inside, every familiar creak carried meaning. To visitors, the sounds blended together into an orchestra of old wood. To the miller, each noise had its own personality. That low groan, perfectly normal. The sharper click, probably harmless. The sudden silence, now that was concerning. Machines, much like children, often became suspiciously quiet immediately before causing trouble. Many millers worked alone during much of the day. Their nearest neighbor might live several hundred meters away, across fields separated by drainage ditches. That doesn't sound especially isolated today. But remember, no telephones, no bicycles during the earliest centuries, no passing automobiles. If something broke, the miller solved it himself. If he became ill, someone else had to travel to the windmill. If severe storms arrived, he often faced them alone. The loneliness surprised many newcomers. Visitors admired the peaceful scenery. They imagined tranquil days, watching clouds drift overhead. Reality proved slightly different. Peaceful? Often. Quiet? Certainly. Lonely, more than most expected. The wind became a constant companion. It whispered through cracks in wooden walls. It rattled shutters. It hummed softly beneath the turning sails. During winter storms, it howled like some enormous, unseen creature wandering across the marshes, experienced millers eventually recognized different kinds of wind by sound alone. Gentle breezes sang, strong winds roared, dangerous gusts announced themselves with unsettling confidence. The miller listened, always listened. His livelihood depended upon understanding the invisible. Of course, many millers did not live entirely alone. Families shared these isolated homes. A wife often managed the household, while simultaneously assisting with countless practical tasks: cooking, cleaning, gardening, keeping chickens, making cheese, repairing clothing, raising children, helping maintain the windmill whenever extra hands became necessary. Life demanded cooperation. There was little room for the strict divisions between mill work and housework. Everyone contributed. Children grew up surrounded by machinery. Long before they understood mathematics, they understood gears. Before learning formal measurements, they learned how changing winds affected the sails. Many boys eventually became millers themselves, not because anyone insisted, simply because it was the world they knew. Their playground happened to include one of medieval Europe's most remarkable engineering achievements. Although parents undoubtedly reminded them not to climb onto moving machinery, history strongly suggests that children have ignored such advice with remarkable consistency. Daughters learned equally valuable skills. They helped maintain the household, cared for younger siblings, tended gardens, and frequently assisted during harvests. In many mill families, every member understood at least the basics of operating the machinery. Emergencies rarely announced themselves politely. If the miller became injured, someone else needed to know what to do. The Marshes were not interested in waiting. Meals were simple: dark bread, cheese, butter, smoked fish, porridge, seasonal vegetables, perhaps bacon on fortunate days. Beer or weak ale often accompanied meals because clean drinking water could be surprisingly difficult to guarantee. Ironically, living beside enormous quantities of water did not always mean having safe water to drink. History enjoys little contradictions like that. The rhythm of family life followed both nature and machinery. Laundry waited for calm weather. Repairs happened during quiet winds. Major maintenance often took place when storms were least likely. Harvest seasons transformed the entire household. Neighbors arrived. Children helped. Everyone worked from sunrise until dusk. Then winter returned with its long evenings. Those evenings could feel endless. Candles were expensive. Books were rare. Entertainment depended largely upon conversation. Stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren. Legends drifted through the warm glow of the fireplace. Old tales spoke of water spirits hiding beneath dark canals, mysterious lights dancing over marshes, ghostly travelers lost in the fog, and strange sounds heard during lonely nights when no one else seemed awake. Some stories probably began as genuine beliefs. Others likely served a practical purpose. Nothing discourages adventurous children from wandering into dangerous bogs, quite like convincing them a ghost lives there. Parents throughout history have displayed remarkable creativity. Religion remained deeply woven into everyday life. Most millers attended church whenever possible. Sunday offered not merely worship, but companionship, a chance to exchange news, discuss repairs, arrange marriages, settle disagreements, borrow tools, share concerns about crops or weather. For families living beside isolated windmills, church represented a vital connection with the wider community. The week could feel surprisingly long between gatherings. Storms brought the greatest tests. Dark clouds approached from the North Sea. The wind strengthened. Rain lashed against wooden walls. Inside the mill, the great gears accelerated. Too much speed became dangerous. The sails had to be slowed, sometimes stopped altogether. Doing so required climbing outside, while enormous wooden arms swept overhead. Imagine standing high above the marshes during a violent storm, rain soaking your clothes, wind trying its very best to introduce you to another province, all while wrestling heavy canvas attached to rotating timbers. It was not work for the faint-hearted, nor for anyone especially attached to remaining perfectly dry. Accidents happened. Falls, broken beams, flying debris, lightning strikes. The life of a miller could appear peaceful from a distance. Up close, it demanded courage almost every season. Yet, despite the hardships, many families remained in the same windmills for generations. Children inherited the profession. Grandsons repaired gears first installed by their grandfathers. Knowledge accumulated slowly. Each generation discovered slightly better methods, a stronger wooden joint, a more efficient brake, a clever way to protect bearings from rain. History often credits inventors. Just as often, it should thank families who quietly improved machines, one tiny adjustment at a time. As decades passed, the windmill became more than a workplace. It became a landmark. Travelers used it for directions. Boats navigated by its silhouette. Artists occasionally sketched it. Children growing up nearby could hardly imagine the landscape without its familiar turning sails. The mill and the family living inside it slowly became part of one another's identity. If the sails stopped unexpectedly, neighbors noticed, someone would eventually walk across the fields to investigate, not from curiosity alone, from concern, because behind every motionless windmill lived people, friends, families, neighbors. Their lives were woven into the same quiet rhythm as the canals, the fields, and the endless Dutch wind. As the evening grows darker, a single candle flickers inside the miller's small home. Outside, the great sails continue turning beneath a sky filled with stars. The steady creak of timber has become almost comforting now, a gentle lullaby carried across the marshes. Tomorrow, however, that peaceful rhythm will face its greatest enemy. Not broken gears, not failing timbers, but nature itself. For in our next chapter, fierce storms, devastating floods, and relentless North Sea winds will remind the Dutch that no matter how ingenious their windmills became, the water was never willing to surrender without a fight. Part 6. Moving entire windmills. Across the landscape by now, the windmill has become almost a member of the family. Its sails greet each sunrise. Its gears murmur through every afternoon. Its familiar silhouette watches over fields that only a generation earlier had been shallow marshes. For many people, that is where the story would naturally end. Build the windmill, drain the land, live happily ever after. History, however, has never been especially interested in simple endings, because one day, after years of faithful service, someone looked at a perfectly good windmill and calmly suggested something rather unexpected. What if we moved it, not repaired it, not rebuilt it, moved it, the entire thing? Imagine announcing this idea during a village meeting. After a long silence, someone would probably ask the obvious question. The whole windmill? Yes. Even the heavy parts? Especially the heavy parts. Another long silence would follow. Then perhaps a slow nod from the village carpenter, who had already begun calculating how many ropes would be required. To modern ears, relocating an entire building sounded extraordinary. To the Dutch, it gradually became another practical solution to a practical problem. The landscape itself refused to stay the same. Marshes shifted, canals changed course, fresh land appeared, old waterways became less useful, new drainage projects demanded mills in different places. A windmill that had once stood in the perfect location might, 50 years later, find itself working far less efficiently. The wind still blew, but the water had moved, or the fields had expanded, or a new canal had been dug several hundred meters away. Sometimes the easiest solution was not constructing an entirely new mill. It was carefully relocating the existing one. The decision was rarely made lightly. A windmill represented years of labor and a considerable financial investment. The great oak beams alone were worth preserving. Timber of such quality did not simply appear whenever someone wanted another machine. Some of the trees used to build the earliest mills had begun growing centuries before the millwright ever sharpened his first chisel. Replacing them would be expensive. Moving them, while difficult, often made better sense. Before a single beam could be lifted, weeks of planning began. Village elders gathered around rough wooden tables. Millwrights inspected every joint. Carpenters examined the condition of the main post. Canal workers measured water depths. Farmers discussed harvest schedules. No one wanted dozens of oxen blocking the only road during planting season, even in the Middle Ages. Construction projects required careful coordination. Only the paperwork was considerably shorter. The first task was making the windmill safe. The sails had to stop completely. Large wooden brakes locked the machinery into place. Canvas coverings were removed and folded carefully. Ropes secured every moving component. Loose tools disappeared into storage chests. The mill, usually so full of gentle motion, became strangely silent. The familiar creaking ceased. The gears rested. For the first time in many years, the building seemed asleep. The miller's family often watched with mixed emotions. Children who had grown up beneath turning sails suddenly saw their home standing perfectly still. It felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling, like meeting an old friend who had forgotten how to smile. Contrary to what many people imagine today, entire windmills were not always dragged intact across great distances. That would have been nearly impossible for many of the larger structures. Instead, skilled workers often dismantled significant portions before moving them. Every beam received careful markings. Roman numerals carved into hidden surfaces identified matching joints. Small symbols indicated which timbers belonged together. Experienced carpenters understood that rebuilding months later depended entirely upon careful organization. There were no printed instruction manuals, no numbered plastic bags, no helpful diagram promising assembly in just 8 easy steps. Only memory, experience, and a remarkable amount of confidence. One misplaced beam could delay the entire project. One forgotten peg might require an additional week's work. The village carpenter therefore treated every piece with extraordinary care. To him, each timber possessed a history. He remembered shaping many of them years earlier. Some bore tiny marks left by his father's tools. Others had darkened from decades of exposure to rain and sunshine. The windmill was more than lumber. It was accumulated craftsmanship. The central post demanded special attention. This enormous oak beam had supported the rotating body of the mill for decades. Removing it required patience bordering on ceremony. Heavy ropes wrapped around the timber. Temporary supports surrounded the structure. Wooden lifting frames creaked beneath the strain. Nothing happened quickly. Nobody wanted centuries of craftsmanship collapsing because someone hurried. A foreman gave quiet instructions. Workers tightened ropes together. The massive beam slowly shifted, only inches, but those inches represented hours of careful effort. Watching the process must have felt almost unbelievable. A building that had appeared, rooted permanently to the earth, was gradually surrendering its foundations. Once dismantled, the real journey began. The Dutch landscape, despite its famous flatness, offered no shortage of challenges. Mud remained everywhere. Roads varied dramatically in quality. Many were little more than compacted earth, following the edges of canals. Heavy wagons could easily become stuck. Fortunately, the Dutch possessed another advantage: water. The very element that had created so many problems also provided one of the easiest methods of transportation. Large beams traveled surprisingly well by boat. Flat-bottomed barges floated enormous timbers through narrow canals. Workers guided them carefully with long poles. The journey looked peaceful from a distance. Closer inspection revealed constant concentration. One poorly judged turn might wedge a priceless oak beam beneath a bridge or against a canal bank. Fortunately, canal boatmen had developed extraordinary skill over generations. They understood every bend, every current, every shallow section. Their knowledge rivaled that of the millwrights themselves. Where canals could not reach, wagons took over. Not elegant wagons, immensely sturdy ones. Broad wooden wheels distributed weight across soft ground. Teams of horses or powerful oxen strained against thick leather harnesses. The pace was almost painfully slow, sometimes no faster than walking, occasionally even slower. Progress measured in meters rather than kilometers. No one complained. The destination mattered far more than the speed. Children from nearby villages often gathered along the route. Imagine being 10 years old and watching an entire windmill pass your front door one beam at a time. It would certainly become the most exciting event of the season, perhaps even the decade. Older villagers smiled knowingly. They had seen such relocations before. Younger children stared in amazement as giant timbers rolled past like pieces of some enormous wooden puzzle. The new site required preparation. Long before the first wagon arrived, foundations had to be strengthened, drainage channels widened, access roads improved, the surrounding land carefully surveyed. There was little point moving a windmill from one poor location to another. Choosing wisely mattered. Millwrights climbed temporary platforms to study prevailing winds. They watched how reed bent during different hours of the day. They observed nearby trees. Even a modest grove could disturb airflow enough to reduce efficiency. Nature remained both partner and obstacle. The wind was free. Finding the best place to capture it demanded experience. Reconstruction resembled the original building process, though with one enormous advantage. Most of the components already existed. Still, placing centuries-old timbers back into their proper positions required precision. The carved markings proved invaluable. Each beam found its partner. Each joint returned to its original place. Wooden pegs locked everything together. Once again, slowly the familiar silhouette rose above the marshes. To travelers arriving months later, it appeared as though the windmill had always stood there. Only those involved remembered its remarkable journey. Some mills moved more than once during their lifetimes. Entire landscapes evolved around them. Canals expanded. New polders emerged. Drainage systems grew increasingly sophisticated. The windmills adapted. Rather than remaining fixed monuments, they became surprisingly mobile tools. Practicality often triumphed over sentiment, although that did not mean sentiment disappeared entirely. Many millers admitted feeling strangely emotional when leaving an old site. A family might have lived there for 20 years. Children had taken their first steps beside those familiar canals. Birthdays celebrated. Winters endured. Storms survived. The view from the upstairs window had become part of daily life. Relocating the mill meant relocating memories as well. Fortunately, the windmill itself came along. Perhaps that made saying goodbye a little easier. By the 17th century, Dutch engineers had become masters of adapting both machines and landscapes. Moving a windmill no longer seemed extraordinary. It became simply another chapter in the endless conversation between people and water. The marshes continued changing. So did the machines built to tame them. Nothing remained completely permanent. Not the canals, not the fields, not even the great wooden windmills that appeared so solid against the horizon. Only the wind itself remained wonderfully consistent, arriving each morning without charging rent. It simply asked that someone build a good sail to catch it. As dusk settles over the reclaimed countryside, the newly relocated windmill finally stands ready. The last rope is untied. The brake is released. A gentle evening breeze reaches across the fields. One sail trembles, then another. Slowly, almost as if remembering an old habit, the great arms begin to turn once more. The gears awaken. The scoop wheel splashes into motion. Water rises toward the canal, exactly as it did before the journey began. The windmill is home again, not because it stands where it was first built, but because wherever the wind and the water meet, its work continues. In our next chapter, however, that quiet work will face its greatest challenge yet. Fierce North Sea, storms, relentless floods, and violent gales will test every beam, every sail, and every family living within these remarkable wooden giants, reminding the Dutch that nature never truly stopped negotiating. Part 7. Floods, Storms, and Constant Repairs. As darkness settles across the reclaimed countryside, the windmill turns with its familiar, comforting rhythm. Creak, splash, groan, splash. The sounds drift gently across quiet canals and sleeping fields. From the doorway of the miller's home, everything appears peaceful, almost too peaceful. The stars shine above the marshes. A faint mist rises from the water. Somewhere nearby, a cow shifts lazily in its pasture. It would be easy to believe that the Dutch had finally won their centuries-long argument with nature. The windmills were working. The canals carried water away. The fields were growing larger every year. Surely the hardest part was over. Nature, however, had been listening to this conversation, and nature disliked overconfidence. If there was one lesson repeated throughout Dutch history, it was this: the sea never admitted defeat, not once, not ever. It merely paused between arguments. The Netherlands occupied one of the most challenging landscapes in medieval Europe. Several great rivers flowed across the country before reaching the North Sea. The Rhine carried water from the distant Alps. The Meuse wound through forests and valleys far to the south. The IJssel branched away, spreading enormous volumes of fresh water across the lowlands. During heavy rainfall upstream, these rivers swelled dramatically. Villagers living hundreds of kilometers away from the storms that caused the flooding often experienced the consequences days later. Imagine waking to perfectly clear skies. The birds are singing, the sun is shining, everything feels wonderfully calm. Then your neighbor calmly announces, "The river is rising." You glance upward, not a cloud in sight. It hardly seems possible. Yet, by evening, muddy water is already creeping across the lower fields. History often reminds us that cause and effect do not always occur in the same place. The rivers were only half the problem. The North Sea supplied the other half. Unlike the gentle canals threading through Dutch villages, the North Sea possessed a personality best described as energetic. On calm summer mornings, fishing boats crossed its waters without much concern. During winter storms, however, the sea became something entirely different. Dark clouds rolled in from the northwest. Pressure dropped. The wind strengthened hour by hour. Waves rose higher. Tides climbed farther inland. The air filled with salt spray. Experienced fishermen often recognized these changes long before storms arrived. They watched the clouds. They studied the flight of seabirds. They noticed subtle shifts in the wind's direction. There was no meteorological office, no weather forecast, only generations of careful observation. Sometimes they guessed correctly. Sometimes the sea surprised everyone. The millers quickly learned that strong winds presented both an opportunity and a danger. Moderate winds were wonderful. They turned the sails steadily. Water flowed from the fields. The machinery worked beautifully. But storms ignored moderation. Instead of steady breezes, violent gusts slammed against the sails with frightening force. The enormous wooden arms that usually turned gracefully now spun with alarming speed. Inside the mill, the gears accelerated. The scoop wheel splashed furiously. Wood groaned beneath enormous strain. Imagine standing inside a building where every beam vibrates, where every gear seems louder than usual, where the walls themselves creak beneath invisible pressure. The mill was alive, and not entirely happy about it. The miller understood immediately. Action could not wait. He climbed toward the brake mechanism. His hands gripped damp wooden rails, polished smooth by years of use. Outside, rain lashed against the structure. The sails blurred through sheets of water. Every movement demanded concentration. The brake consisted of heavy wooden blocks pressed firmly against the great brake wheel attached to the main shaft. Pulling the brake, too, suddenly risked damaging the machinery. Applying it too slowly allowed the sails to gather even more speed. The balance required experience. There were no written manuals explaining precisely what to do when the wind reached dangerous levels. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next, father to son, master to apprentice. Years of practice compressed into instinct. Sometimes the safest solution involved stopping the windmill entirely, but stopping it was only the beginning. The canvas sails needed to be secured before powerful gusts tore them apart. That meant climbing outside. Imagine stepping onto narrow wooden platforms. High above the marshes, the rain stings your face. The wind grabs your clothing. Below, drainage canals disappear beneath gray water. Above, giant sails continue moving with tremendous force. Every knot must be tied correctly, every rope checked twice. There was no room for mistakes. One careless moment could prove fatal. Millers rarely thought of themselves as heroes. They considered this simply part of the job. History often hides bravery inside ordinary professions. Meanwhile, the villages below prepared in their own way. Church bells rang, not for worship, but as warnings. Farmers hurried livestock toward higher ground. Children carried tools indoors. Boats were tied securely along canal banks. Women filled barrels with fresh drinking water. Food was stored safely above flood level. Everyone knew their responsibilities. Centuries of experience had taught painful lessons. Storms rewarded preparation. They punished complacency. Was as darkness fell, the first waves struck the sea dikes. The sound echoed across the coast like distant thunder, again and again and again. Each impact shook the earthen embankments, protecting thousands of hectares of reclaimed land. These dikes represented generations of labor, millions of baskets filled with earth, countless wooden piles driven into soft ground, thousands upon thousands of anonymous workers who had slowly built barriers between civilization and the sea. Tonight, every one of those efforts faced examination. Most of the time, the dikes held. Sometimes they did not. When a breach appeared, even a small one, the consequences unfolded rapidly. Water rushed through narrow openings with astonishing power. Tiny cracks became wide gaps. Wide gaps became roaring torrents. Within hours, fields vanished beneath muddy water. Roads disappeared. Bridges washed away. Livestock struggled desperately against powerful currents. Entire harvests could disappear in a single night. One of the greatest flood disasters of the medieval Low Countries occurred in 1287, when the devastating St. Lucia's flood swept across large parts of the region. Villages vanished. Thousands of people lost their lives. The coastline itself changed. Large inland lakes expanded dramatically, including what later became the Great Inland Sea, known as the Zuiderzee. Nature had redrawn the map without asking permission, without leaving room for appeal. Generations afterward, grandparents still told stories about that terrible storm, not to frighten children. Well, perhaps a little, but mostly to remind them that the sea possessed a long memory. Back at the Windmills, the storm finally began to weaken. Morning revealed the damage. Broken sailcloth fluttered in tatters. Several gear teeth had snapped beneath excessive strain. Wooden shingles littered the ground. One drainage canal overflowed completely. Another had collapsed along one bank. The mill itself still stood, barely. Repairs began almost immediately. No committee meetings, no lengthy debates, no one saying, "Perhaps we'll deal with it next month." Water had already scheduled tomorrow's problems. The villagers gathered with tools in hand. Carpenters carried axes, adzes, and chisels. Blacksmiths arrived with newly forged iron fittings. Farmers brought horses. Children collected scattered pegs and broken boards. Women prepared meals for workers who would remain outside from sunrise until sunset. The entire community became a repair crew. The millwright inspected every major timber. His eyes noticed details invisible to everyone else. A hairline crack near an axle, a beam twisted only slightly out of alignment, a loosened brace. Small defects mattered. Ignoring them invited larger failures later. The damaged gear teeth required particular skill. Fortunately, medieval millwrights designed many gears so that individual wooden cogs could be replaced without rebuilding the entire wheel. It was an elegant solution. Remove the damaged tooth, shape a new one from seasoned hardwood, fit it carefully into place, test the movement, adjust, test again. The process demanded patience rather than speed. The machinery rewarded careful craftsmanship. As the repairs continued over the following days, the familiar sounds slowly returned. The gentle creak of turning gears, the splash of the scoop wheel, the whisper of wind through canvas sails. To the villagers, these sounds meant something more than successful engineering. They meant normal life had returned. Fields could dry again. Livestock could graze safely. Children could laugh without hearing storm bells. The windmills had survived. Once more, that perhaps became the greatest achievement of all. Not that they never failed. Everything built by human hands eventually requires repair. Rather, they endured because every broken beam found a carpenter. Every damaged sail found a seamstress. Every cracked gear found a patient millwright. Generation after generation, ordinary people quietly refuse to let the machinery stop. As evening settles over the marshes once more, the repaired windmill stands proudly against the fading sky. Fresh timber glows a little lighter than the older oak surrounding it. Like new stitches in a well-loved coat, the sails begin another slow rotation. Water rises gently toward the canals. The countryside breathes a little easier, but history is moving forward. The small villages that once struggled merely to survive are becoming wealthier, busier, and increasingly ambitious. Soon, these humble drainage mills will become part of something far greater than local farming. They will help power one of the richest trading nations the world has ever known. That remarkable transformation awaits us in the next chapter As the Dutch Golden Age dawns and the windmills take on new roles in a rapidly changing world. Part 8. Rival mill owners and village politics. If you've been following our journey from the very beginning, you've probably started to think that the greatest challenge facing a Dutch windmill was water, or perhaps the wind, or maybe the occasional goose, with an unfortunate sense of timing, reasonable guesses, all of them. But as history has demonstrated time and again, one of humanity's favorite obstacles has always been other humans. The windmills drained marshes, the canals carried water away, the dikes held back the sea. Yet behind every successful engineering project stood dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people trying to agree on who would pay for it, who would maintain it, who would benefit from it, and, perhaps most importantly, whose fault it was when something broke. In other words, village politics, not the sort involving grand speeches beneath marble columns. Nothing quite so dramatic. Instead, picture a chilly autumn afternoon inside a modest village hall. Heavy oak beams support the roof. A peat fire crackles gently in the corner. Boots leave muddy footprints across the floor. Around a long wooden table sit farmers, millers, local landowners, priests, merchants, and a few respected elders. Each has come to discuss the same subject: water. Again, one imagines newcomers occasionally asking, "Do you ever discuss anything else?" The answer was almost certainly, "Not while the fields are flooding." For the Dutch, managing water required something far more difficult than building windmills. It required cooperation. One farmer could repair his own fence. One carpenter could rebuild his own house. But nobody could drain an entire marsh alone. The canals crossed many properties. The dikes protected entire regions. The windmills often served dozens of farms simultaneously. Success depended upon neighbors working together. Conveniently, neighbors do not always enjoy working together. The problem usually began with money. Building a drainage windmill cost a considerable fortune. Timber, stone foundations, iron fittings, canvas, skilled labor, transport, maintenance. Everything required investment. Someone had to provide the funds. Sometimes a wealthy landowner financed construction. Sometimes several villages shared the expense. Occasionally, monasteries contributed, recognizing that dry farmland produced reliable harvests and, perhaps just as importantly, reliable rents. Where money appeared, disagreements soon followed. A prosperous merchant might argue that because he paid more toward construction, his fields deserved drainage first. A smaller farmer would politely disagree, or perhaps not so politely. The miller, caught somewhere in the middle, usually preferred everyone remain calm. After all, angry customers rarely improved machinery. Fortunately, the Dutch developed an institution that became one of history's quiet masterpieces of local government, the regional water boards. Long before many European kingdoms developed efficient national administrations, communities across the Low Countries organized cooperative bodies responsible for managing water. These organizations, often called waterschappen, brought together landowners, farmers, clergy, and local officials. Their purpose was refreshingly practical: maintain the dikes, inspect the canals, collect contributions, resolve disputes, and remind everyone that water cared remarkably little about property boundaries. The meetings were rarely glamorous. Imagine spending an entire afternoon discussing whether a drainage ditch should be widened by another meter. No kings, no glittering crowns, no dramatic sword fights, just adults arguing politely about mud. Oddly enough, it proved remarkably effective. Records from surviving medieval meetings reveal endless discussions over maintenance schedules, labor obligations, damaged embankments, and the allocation of costs. Every participant understood one uncomfortable truth. If they failed to cooperate, everyone might lose. Floodwater possessed an extraordinary commitment to equality. It soaked rich and poor alike. Mill owners occupied an interesting position within these communities. Some owned only a single drainage mill. Others gradually accumulated several. A particularly successful owner might lease operations to experienced millers while concentrating on finances. This arrangement worked well. Most of the time, problems emerged whenever neighboring mills served adjacent drainage districts. Imagine two mill owners standing beside the same canal. One wishes to lower water quickly. The other worries that doing so will overwhelm his own drainage system. Neither is entirely wrong. Both possess perfectly reasonable arguments. Unfortunately, water refuses to wait while reasonable people negotiate. Careful planning became essential. Drainage schedules were coordinated. Sluice gates opened according to agreed rules. Canal levels were measured constantly. Ignoring these agreements risked flooding someone else's fields. One person's successful drainage could easily become another person's disaster. The millers themselves often acted as unofficial diplomats. Their profession demanded technical knowledge, but it also required diplomacy. A skilled miller understood gears. An excellent miller understood neighbors. Suppose two farmers arrived at the mill simultaneously. Each insisted his fields required immediate attention. Both claimed crops would fail without faster drainage. The miller listened patiently. He knew arguing accomplished little. Instead, he consulted canal levels, observed the weather, and followed established agreements whenever possible. Sometimes neither farmer left completely satisfied, yet both usually returned the following week. Trust developed slowly, very slowly, like almost everything else in the marshes. Friendly competition also appeared. Villages quietly admired efficient windmills. Visitors compared machinery. Millwrights discussed clever improvements. One community proudly installed larger scoop wheels. Another experimented with stronger gearing. Soon, neighboring villages wanted similar innovations. Nobody openly admitted feeling competitive. They merely happened to mention, rather frequently, that their own windmill drained fields just a little faster than the one across the canal. Entire conversations probably unfolded something like this. Our mill drained 3 meadows yesterday. Really? Yes. Ours managed 4. Interesting. Very. History often disguises rivalry beneath excellent manners. Occasionally, disputes reach local courts. A collapsed canal bank might flood several properties. Who should pay? A damaged dike failed because repairs had been delayed. Who carried responsibility? A mill owner neglected maintenance. Should neighboring farmers compensate for resulting losses? legal records reveal surprisingly modern concerns. Contracts, liability, shared expenses, inspection reports. The language differs. Human nature does not. One particularly common disagreement involved maintenance duties. Every landowner benefiting from drainage contributed labor or money toward repairs. At least, that was the expectation. Reality proved slightly more complicated. Some individuals delayed payments. Others conveniently disappeared whenever heavy digging became necessary. A few developed astonishingly creative excuses. My horse is lame. My son is ill. I would certainly help, but unfortunately, I have developed an urgent appointment involving absolutely anything else. Village elders generally recognize these tactics. They also possessed methods for encouraging participation, fines, public criticism, or assigning even more work later. Community memory remained remarkably sharp, especially regarding unfinished responsibilities. Women, though often absent from official records, influenced village politics in quieter ways. Many managed household finances, while husbands worked the fields. Widows occasionally inherited property and therefore voting rights within local water organizations. Merchant families discussed canal projects around dinner tables. Farmers' wives exchanged information while selling cheese and butter at markets. News traveled efficiently. Long before newspapers became common, entire villages somehow knew who had neglected a dike repair. No one seemed entirely certain how the information spread. It simply did. Perhaps gossip deserves recognition as one of history's most effective communication networks. Even children noticed local rivalries. A boy whose father operated one windmill might proudly insist theirs possessed the strongest sails in the district. Another child disagreed immediately. Friendly arguments followed, occasionally accompanied by races along canal banks. Fortunately, these competitions rarely lasted beyond sunset. Tomorrow, everyone still needed the same drainage system. As Dutch engineering advanced, cooperation became even more important. Individual windmills gradually connected into larger drainage networks. One mill lifted water into a higher canal. A second raised it farther. Sometimes a third completed the journey toward rivers or the sea. The machinery itself formed a chain. If one mill failed, the entire system suffered. Success no longer depended upon isolated brilliance. It required reliable teamwork. The arrangement reflected Dutch society itself. Thousands of individuals, countless villages, different interests, different occupations, yet all connected by water and all dependent upon one another. Perhaps this explains why historians often describe Dutch water management as one of the foundations of the country's political culture. Compromise was not merely admirable, it was practical. The sea rewarded cooperation, it punished stubbornness. As twilight settles over another peaceful evening, the village meeting finally comes to an end. The arguments have grown quieter. Agreements have been written. Hands are shaken. Not because everyone is delighted with the outcome, but because tomorrow's rising water leaves little room for endless disagreement. Outside, the windmill continues, its steady turning beneath the fading sky. It neither knows nor cares who won the debate inside the hall. Its duty remains unchanged. Lift the water, protect the fields, keep turning. In our next chapter, we'll leave the village meetings behind and step into the fascinating world of marshland folklore, where lonely windmills, drifting fog, and endless canals gave rise to mysterious legends, curious superstitions, and stories whispered beside peat fires for generations. Part 9. Strange Superstitions of the Marshlands. The village meeting has ended. The last lantern disappears down the muddy lane. The miller closes the heavy wooden door against the evening chill, and silence slowly settles across the reclaimed fields. Well, almost silence. The windmill continues its steady rhythm. Creak, splash, creak, splash. After so many nights, the sound has become strangely comforting. It is the heartbeat of the marshes. Tonight, however, we leave behind engineering and village politics. Instead, we step into the world that existed after sunset, a world where practical Dutch farmers, people capable of designing ingenious drainage systems and constructing remarkable machinery, also believed there were certain places where one simply did not wander after dark, especially if the fog had begun to roll in. History has a delightful habit of reminding us that intelligence and superstition have never been complete strangers. The very same carpenter who could calculate the perfect angle for a windmill sail might also refuse to whistle while crossing a lonely bridge at midnight. The miller who understood every gear inside his machinery might quietly make the sign of the cross before walking into thick marsh fog. People are wonderfully complicated, and medieval people were no exception. The Dutch marshlands possessed all the ingredients necessary for strange stories. There was water everywhere. Canals reflected the moonlight. Mist drifted across low fields without warning. Reeds whispered constantly in the wind. Birds called from unseen places. Every familiar landmark looked entirely different after sunset. Even today, anyone walking through wetlands on a foggy evening quickly discovers that ordinary landscapes can become remarkably mysterious. Now imagine doing the same journey 800 years ago. No electric lights, no flashlights, no paved roads, only a small oil lantern whose flame struggled against every gust of wind. Suddenly, every unusual sound demanded an explanation. One of the oldest beliefs concerned the marsh lights. Travelers occasionally reported seeing small floating lights dancing above the bogs. They appeared without warning, sometimes blue, sometimes pale white, sometimes moving as though someone invisible carried a tiny lantern through the darkness. Today, we understand that gases released from decaying vegetation can occasionally ignite or create strange visual effects under particular conditions. Medieval villagers, understandably, developed rather more imaginative explanations. Some believed these wandering lights were restless spirits. Others called them ghost lanterns, guiding careless travelers toward dangerous bogs. Parents often warned children, if you follow the lights, you may never find your way home. Considering how easy it was to become lost in wetlands, this advice probably saved more lives than any scientific explanation could have managed. Fear occasionally serves a practical purpose. The canals themselves attracted legends. Deep water always inspires stories. People disappear. Boats overturn. Fog conceals familiar landmarks. The imagination quietly fills whatever details reality leaves behind. Many Dutch communities spoke of mysterious women appearing beside lonely waterways. They were sometimes described as pale figures wearing old-fashioned clothing. Travelers claimed they stood silently on canal banks before vanishing into the mist. Were they ghosts, spirits, lonely widows searching for lost husbands? Most likely they were tricks of moonlight reflected through drifting fog. But after walking alone for several hours in complete darkness, certainty becomes surprisingly flexible. Millers occasionally claimed their windmills possessed personalities, not in the sense that they literally believed the buildings could speak, at least not always. Rather, experienced millers spent so many years listening to the machinery that every unfamiliar sound immediately attracted attention. A new creak, an unexpected groan, a rhythmic tapping. To outsiders, these noises meant nothing. To the miller, they suggested loose gears, changing weather, or perhaps a beam settling after heavy rain. Still, when unusual sounds appeared during perfectly calm nights, even practical people occasionally wondered. One old story tells of a miller who awoke every midnight to hear footsteps climbing the wooden stairs, slow, measured, always stopping just outside the machinery room. Each time he opened the door, nothing, no footprints, no visitor, only the quiet wind slipping through narrow cracks in the walls. Perhaps shrinking timber explained everything. Perhaps not. Stories rarely improve by explaining themselves too thoroughly. The wind itself became the subject of endless speculation. Everyone understood that wind powered the mills. Nobody fully understood why it sometimes changed direction so suddenly. An elderly fisherman might confidently announce that tomorrow's breeze smelled different. A farmer would agree. The miller quietly adjusted his sails. Sometimes they were correct. Sometimes they were spectacularly wrong. Yet experience had taught them to observe tiny details modern people often overlook: cloud shapes, bird behavior, humidity, the smell of distant rain. Practical observation gradually blended with folklore until separating one from the other became almost impossible. Certain winds gained reputations. An easterly breeze promised dry weather. A northwesterly wind invited caution. Strong southern winds occasionally inspired nervous glances toward the sea, not because the direction itself possessed magical powers, but because generations had noticed familiar patterns. Science often begins as careful observation long before anyone develops mathematical explanations. Some beliefs, however, wandered well beyond observation. Many villagers disliked pointing directly at a windmill while its sails turned. Others avoided walking beneath moving sails whenever possible. Some insisted that speaking carelessly about storms invited bad weather. A few claimed repairing machinery on particular feast days brought terrible luck. Whether anyone genuinely believed, these traditions varied greatly. Yet they continued, because traditions have remarkable staying power, especially when nobody wishes to become the person who ignored them immediately before something unfortunate happened. Millwrights developed superstitions of their own. Many preferred beginning major construction shortly after sunrise rather than near sunset, not because the spirits of the marsh demanded it, mostly because good daylight reduced expensive mistakes. Nevertheless, younger apprentices occasionally interpreted practical habits as ancient rituals. By the time the stories reached the next village, ordinary scheduling had become mysterious ceremony. Human beings have always enjoyed improving stories through enthusiastic retelling. Children naturally adored every frightening tale. Grandparents became gifted storytellers during long winter evenings. Outside, snow covered the fields. The wind rattled the shutters. Inside, the fireplace crackled warmly. Perfect conditions for introducing mysterious creatures living somewhere beyond the last drainage ditch. One popular figure throughout Dutch folklore was the Witte Wieven, often translated as the White Women. These ghostly beings were said to appear as pale, mist-like figures drifting across lonely landscapes, particularly near ancient burial sites, forests, and isolated wetlands. Some legends described them as wise women from long ago. Others portrayed them as restless spirits. Still others insisted they simply disliked noisy travelers. Exactly what they wanted remained delightfully inconsistent, which perhaps made them even more unsettling. Then there were stories of the water wolf. Unlike an ordinary wolf, this creature did not hunt sheep. It hunted land. The water wolf represented the relentless expansion of lakes and floodwaters that gradually swallowed farms and villages. As shorelines eroded year after year, people imagined the advancing water as a giant beast patiently eating the countryside. It was a remarkably poetic way of describing coastal erosion, also a considerably more memorable one. Parents told children, "The water wolf is hungry." The children understood immediately. Stay away from collapsing banks. Respect the canals. Do not play beside dangerous water. Again, folklore quietly reinforced common sense. Not every superstition centered upon danger. Some brought comfort instead. Millers occasionally believed that hearing certain birds before sunrise promised favorable winds. Others considered swallows nesting beneath the eaves a sign of prosperity. Finding a feather near the windmill door might predict good fortune. Whether these beliefs changed reality mattered less than the hope they offered. Life beside the marshes contained enough uncertainty already. A little optimism cost nothing. Religion gradually blended with older traditions. Church bells rang before severe storms. Priests blessed newly completed dikes. Crosses appeared beside dangerous waterways. Many families prayed before major repairs. Faith and folklore coexisted remarkably well. One explained God's protection. The other reminded children not to wander into bogs chasing mysterious lights. Together, they covered most situations. Perhaps the most enduring superstition surrounded silence itself. Experienced travelers often remarked how strangely quiet the marshes became immediately before heavy fog. Birdsong faded. The breeze weakened. Sound seemed somehow muffled. People noticed. Explanations differed. Some claimed the spirits were listening. Others believed nature itself was holding its breath. Today, meteorologists could provide rather satisfying explanations involving humidity, temperature inversions, and atmospheric conditions. Those explanations, however, are admittedly less dramatic around a fireplace. As centuries passed, many of these old beliefs slowly faded. Scientific understanding expanded. Maps improved. Roads became safer. Lanterns became brighter. Eventually, electricity transformed even the darkest countryside. Yet, The stories never disappeared entirely. They simply became stories, passed from grandparents to grandchildren, retold during festivals, remembered whenever evening mist drifted once again across quiet canals. Because every landscape deserves its legends, and few landscapes inspired the imagination quite like the lonely Dutch marshes. As midnight approaches, the fog returns one final time. The windmill turns patiently above the sleeping fields. Its great sails disappear into drifting mist before emerging again beneath the moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, an owl calls softly. A fisherman ties his boat securely beside the canal. The miller checks the brake one last time before heading inside. Behind him, the wind continues its endless work. Whether spirits walk beside the canals tonight, or whether only the mist wanders there, is perhaps best left unanswered. After all, bedtime stories lose a little of their charm when every mystery receives a perfectly sensible explanation. In our next chapter, dawn will rise over a very different Netherlands. Trade will flourish, cities will expand, and the humble drainage windmills that once protected scattered villages will become silent partners in one of the greatest periods of prosperity Europe had ever seen, the Dutch Golden Age. Part 10. Windmills. During the Dutch Golden Age, morning returns quietly to the marshes. The mist that drifted through last night's ghost stories begins to dissolve beneath the first pale light of dawn. Dew sparkles on the reeds. Waterfowl paddle lazily through narrow canals. And somewhere in the distance, a familiar windmill has already begun its patient work. Creak, splash, creak, splash. It is a sound that has echoed across these lowlands for generations. But something has changed. The villages around the windmill are no longer quite so small. The canals are busier, the roads are firmer. More boats travel the waterways each year, carrying goods instead of merely hopes. The Dutch are entering an extraordinary period that historians would later call the Dutch Golden Age. Of course, nobody living through it knew they were enjoying a golden age. People rarely wake up one morning announcing, "Good news, everyone. We've officially become historically significant." Instead, life simply became a little busier each year. A few more ships, a few more merchants, another warehouse, another canal, another windmill. Looking backward, historians connect the dots. The people living there simply called it Tuesday. By the early 17th century, the Dutch Republic had emerged as one of Europe's most energetic trading powers. Its ships sailed astonishing distances. Merchant fleets crossed the North Sea, the Baltic, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic Ocean, and eventually reached Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Ports that had once served mostly local fishermen now welcomed vessels loaded with spices, silk, timber, grain, whale oil, wine, salt, and countless other goods. Harbors buzzed from dawn until long after sunset. The smell of tar mixed with sea salt. Ropes creaked against wooden masts. Dock workers shouted instructions as cranes lifted heavy cargo onto waiting wagons. Compared with the quiet marshes surrounding the drainage mills, these ports felt almost overwhelming, yet they depended upon one another, because every prosperous city still required dry land, and dry land remained the quiet responsibility of thousands of windmills scattered across the countryside. Visitors arriving in Holland often noticed something remarkable. The country appeared almost organized. Fields stretched neatly behind carefully maintained dikes. Straight canals divided the landscape into orderly patterns. Roads remained surprisingly dependable. Despite the wet climate, water moved where people intended it to move, at least most of the time. This orderly appearance was not an accident. It represented centuries of continuous labor. Every drainage ditch, every embankment, every sluice gate, every windmill, each formed part of one enormous engineering system. Foreign travelers frequently admired Dutch cities. Many forgot to admire the machinery quietly keeping those cities dry. History often celebrates visible achievements while overlooking the infrastructure beneath them. Without the drainage windmills, much of this remarkable prosperity could never have existed. As trade expanded, reclaimed farmland became increasingly valuable. Cities needed food. Growing urban populations required grain, vegetables, dairy products, and meat. The reclaimed polders supplied much of it. Cattle grazed peacefully where marsh birds had once nested. Fields of rye and wheat replaced shallow pools. Farmhouses multiplied. Every successful harvest owed a quiet debt to the steady turning of nearby windmills. The millers noticed these changes. They watched more boats pass along widening canals. Merchants occasionally stopped to inspect newly reclaimed land. Surveyors appeared, carrying measuring rods and notebooks. Government officials visited more frequently than before. The lonely profession of the miller gradually became connected to a rapidly expanding national economy. He still rose before dawn. He still inspected gears. He still worried about storms. But now the water he lifted protected farmland feeding thousands rather than dozens. His daily routine had become part of something much larger. The Dutch also discovered that wind could perform many kinds of work besides pumping water. The same mechanical principles powering drainage mills could drive entirely different industries. Soon, new varieties of windmills appeared across the Republic. Some ground grain, others pressed oil from flax and rapeseed. Some crushed pigments for paint, others processed tobacco. Paper mills transformed old cloth into fine writing paper. Textile mills prepared fibers for weaving. Perhaps most impressively, sawmills revolutionized shipbuilding. The invention of the crank-operated sawmill dramatically increased the speed at which logs could be cut into planks. What once demanded exhausting manual labor from teams of sawyers could now be accomplished far more efficiently using wind power. Entire forests arriving from Scandinavia were transformed into neatly cut timber, ready for shipyards. The invisible wind was quietly building fleets. One cannot help admiring the efficiency. Nature supplied the energy. The Dutch simply learned to organize it exceptionally well. Around the bustling region known as the Zaan district, visitors encountered forests of windmills. Not forests made of trees, forests made of machinery. Dozens, eventually hundreds, each performing a specialized task. Their sails turned at different speeds. Their gears produced different rhythms. Together, they created one of the earliest industrial landscapes in the world. Standing there must have been unforgettable. Imagine looking across the horizon and seeing sail after sail turning beneath broad northern skies. The air carried the scent of fresh-cut timber, flour, linseed oil, damp earth, and smoke from nearby workshops. Everywhere, something was being made. The countryside itself seemed to have become one vast workshop. Of course, such growth brought fresh challenges. More reclaimed land required more maintenance. Larger canals demanded stronger dikes. Heavier commercial traffic increased wear on bridges and locks. Success rarely reduced work. It simply changed its nature. The waterboards became more sophisticated. Engineers carefully measured water levels. Records grew increasingly detailed. Maps improved. Canal systems expanded. The Dutch were gradually becoming masters of hydraulic engineering, not because they sought fame, because they preferred dry feet. Practical motivations often produce extraordinary results. Artists of the Golden Age also noticed the windmills. Painters wandered into the countryside, carrying easels and pigments, rather than portraying only kings or saints. Many celebrated ordinary landscapes, wide skies, reflective canals, farmhouses, grazing cattle, and always, somewhere in the distance, the familiar silhouette of a windmill. To modern viewers, these paintings feel peaceful, almost timeless. Yet the people who created them understood exactly what those windmills represented: security, prosperity, hard work. Without them, much of the beautiful countryside would still lie beneath shallow water. Even wealthy merchants respected the machinery. Many invested in drainage companies, reclaiming entirely new polders from lakes and marshes. Large projects required enormous cooperation. Surveyors mapped the land. Engineers designed canals. Laborers strengthened dikes. Millwrights constructed new drainage mills. Investors patiently waited years before seeing returns. It was capitalism proceeding at the speed of mud. Slow, methodical, surprisingly successful. One famous example was the drainage of the Beemster Lake in the early 17th century. Using a carefully coordinated system of dozens of windmills, engineers gradually pumped millions of tons of water from the lake. What emerged was not simply dry land. It was a meticulously planned landscape of straight roads, geometric canals, orderly farms, and productive fields. Visitors marveled at the transformation. Nature had not disappeared. It had been reorganized. The millers working these systems understood their responsibilities. One neglected machine could affect many neighboring farms. If a drainage mill stopped unexpectedly, water levels rose, canals overflowed, fields suffered. The network depended upon reliability. Every mill became one link in a chain stretching across the countryside. It was teamwork on a national scale. Yet daily life remained surprisingly ordinary. The miller still sharpened tools. Children still chased ducks beside the canals. Women still baked bread and churned butter. Storms still arrived without invitation. The sails still needed repairs. History often imagines great ages as constant excitement. Reality contained plenty of routine. Fortunately, civilizations are built far more often through ordinary mornings than extraordinary afternoons. As prosperity increased, so too did curiosity. Foreign visitors arrived specifically to study Dutch engineering. Kings sent observers. Princes dispatched architects. Military engineers took careful notes. How had this small republic managed to reshape so much difficult landscape? The answer disappointed anyone hoping for a single brilliant invention. There wasn't one. Instead, there were centuries of cooperation, thousands of practical improvements, generations of patient labor, an endless willingness to repair yesterday's mistakes before beginning tomorrow's work. Perhaps that lesson remains the most impressive of all. The Golden Age did not emerge from one miraculous moment. It emerged one windmill rotation at a time, one canal at a time, one repaired dike, one reclaimed field, one determined village after another. As the sun slowly sets over the prosperous Dutch countryside, merchant ships can be seen returning home along distant waterways. Church towers rise above growing towns. Farmhouses stand safely upon land their ancestors could scarcely have imagined. The windmills continue turning exactly as they always have, quietly, patiently, without applause. They ask for no monuments, only a steady breeze. But change, as always, is approaching. Far away, inventors are experimenting with new sources of power, engines fueled not by wind, but by fire and steam. For centuries, the sails have ruled the marshes. Soon, they will meet a rival unlike any they have faced before, And in our next chapter, we will witness the slow arrival of the Industrial Revolution when steam engines begin challenging the ancient partnership between wind, water, and the remarkable wooden giants that transformed the Netherlands forever. Part 11. The Arrival of Steam and the Slow Decline. For hundreds of years, the rhythm of the Dutch countryside had remained remarkably consistent. Morning mist drifted across quiet canals. The wind stirred the reeds. A miller climbed the familiar wooden stairs. The brake was released. The great sails caught the first breeze of the day. Creak, splash, creak, splash. The sound had become so ordinary that most people hardly noticed it anymore. That is often the fate of the world's greatest inventions. They become so reliable, so thoroughly woven into everyday life, that their brilliance fades into the background. Few villagers stopped each morning to admire the windmill. They simply expected it to be there, turning, working, protecting. It had always been that way. Surely it always would be. History, however, has a habit of quietly introducing new ideas, while everyone is busy maintaining the old ones. This particular idea arrived with smoke and iron and an astonishing appetite for coal. Long before steam engines transformed factories, inventors across Europe had been searching for better ways to harness power. The challenge was always the same. Wind was free. Water was dependable in some places. Human muscles grew tired. Horses required food. What people wanted was a machine that worked whenever asked, regardless of the weather, regardless of the season, regardless of whether the breeze had decided to spend the afternoon somewhere over Germany. The earliest steam engines were not elegant. They were enormous, heavy, expensive, and remarkably fond of making loud noises. If Dutch windmills resembled graceful dancers, slowly turning beneath open skies, early steam engines resembled determined blacksmiths who solved every problem by being considerably larger than it. Subtle they were not. Useful they certainly could be. The first reports reached Dutch engineers gradually. Travelers described strange pumping machines operating in Britain. Mining districts used them to remove water from deep shafts. Factory owners experimented with them. Engineers exchanged letters. Sketches crossed borders. Curiosity grew. At first, few Dutch millers felt particularly concerned. After all, the wind had served them faithfully for centuries. Steam seemed complicated. It required fuel, boilers, maintenance, skilled operators. The wind, by comparison, merely requested a little patience. Besides, everyone knew that no machine could possibly replace thousands of perfectly good windmills. History has heard that sentence many times, usually just before something unexpected happens. The Industrial Revolution did not arrive in the Netherlands overnight. It drifted in gradually, almost politely. One factory installed new machinery. Another experimented with mechanical improvements. Cities expanded. Railways slowly appeared. Iron production increased. Every decade brought another innovation. No single invention destroyed the age of windmills. Instead, countless small changes slowly altered the world around them. One of the greatest advantages of steam power became obvious almost immediately: consistency. A steam engine did not wait for favorable weather. It worked during calm summer afternoons. It worked beneath cloudy skies. It worked on still winter mornings when the sails hung motionless against the horizon. As long as someone supplied coal and water, the engine continued pumping. To engineers responsible for protecting valuable farmland, this reliability proved extremely attractive. Millers understood the problem well. They had spent entire careers watching the sky. Some days the wind arrived generously. Other days it disappeared entirely. During prolonged calm periods, drainage slowed. Water levels rose. Farmers grew anxious. The miller could do little except wait. Waiting, unfortunately, rarely impressed flooded crops. Steam promised something different, not perfection, but predictability. Government officials began studying the new technology carefully. Water boards sent engineers to inspect steam-powered pumping stations. Reports filled with measurements and observations returned to town halls. How much water could these engines move? How much coal did they consume? How expensive were repairs? Could they survive harsh winters? The Dutch approached innovation much as they had approached water management itself, patiently, methodically. No one rushed to dismantle hundreds of functioning windmills simply because a new invention had appeared. That would have been remarkably wasteful. Instead, steam engines were introduced where they offered the greatest advantage, particularly in larger drainage projects requiring continuous pumping. Some millers welcomed the changes. Older men, whose knees protested every climb up narrow ladders, quietly admitted that machines requiring fewer midnight storm inspections sounded rather appealing. Others remained skeptical. They trusted wood, canvas-oak gears, things they could repair with their own hands. A broken timber could be replaced by a village carpenter. A damaged boiler demanded specialized knowledge. The world was becoming more complicated. That realization unsettled many people. The younger generation often viewed the situation differently. Apprentices fascinated by mechanics eagerly studied iron engines. Some left traditional windmills altogether, finding employment in factories or steam pumping stations. Their fathers occasionally shook their heads. Their grandfathers shook them even more enthusiastically. Every generation has quietly wondered why the next insists on doing everything differently. The 19th century became an age of transition. Across the countryside, old and new technologies frequently stood side by side. A graceful wooden windmill turned steadily beside a brick pumping station crowned with a tall chimney. One captured invisible breezes, the other transformed burning coal into mechanical force. Together, they represented two eras, meeting upon the same landscape. Visitors found the contrast fascinating. Artists certainly did. Paintings from this period often captured both machines within a single scene. The ancient sails, the modern smokestack, nature and industry sharing the horizon, neither entirely victorious, neither completely defeated, just changing. Some of the greatest drainage projects eventually relied almost entirely upon steam. Large lakes that would once have required dozens of windmills could now be emptied more efficiently using powerful pumping engines. One famous example was the draining of the Haarlemmer Meer during the mid-19th century. For centuries, this vast lake had threatened nearby towns. Storms frequently enlarged its shores. People nicknamed it the water wolf, believing it slowly devoured the surrounding land. This time, however, the Dutch fought back using steam. 3 enormous pumping stations worked tirelessly for years, removing unimaginable quantities of water. When the lake finally disappeared, thousands of hectares of fertile land emerged. It was one of Europe's greatest engineering achievements. The windmills watched from nearby fields, still turning, still useful, yet no longer alone. Not every mill vanished immediately. Far from it. Many continued operating for decades. Some remained more economical than steam engines in smaller drainage districts. Others ground grain or processed raw materials exactly as they always had. The decline proved remarkably slow. History rarely replaces entire technologies overnight. Old systems linger, new systems mature. The transition resembles a long conversation rather than a sudden argument. Still, changes accumulated. Younger millers became fewer. Some villages no longer trained apprentices. Repairing aging machinery grew increasingly expensive. Timber weathered, canvas wore thin. Finding skilled millwrights became more difficult, as industrial careers attracted talented craftsmen elsewhere. Even the landscape began changing. Railway lines crossed reclaimed fields. Factories rose near expanding towns. Telegraph wires stretched between communities. Smoke occasionally drifted across horizons, once occupied only by clouds. The countryside remained beautiful, just different. Some elderly millers experienced quiet sadness. They did not resent progress. Most understood its benefits perfectly well. They simply missed the world they had known. The familiar sounds, the smell of fresh oak shavings, the satisfaction of adjusting sails before sunrise, watching children learn the profession that had belonged to their family for generations. Every age leaves something behind. That is the price of moving forward. Fortunately, not everyone viewed the old windmills as obsolete relics. Artists continued painting them. Writers described them lovingly. Travelers paused to sketch their graceful silhouettes against broad Dutch skies. Gradually, people began recognizing that these machines represented more than practical engineering. They embodied centuries of patience, cooperation, craftsmanship, a national conversation with water itself. Communities started preserving particularly historic mills, not because they still provided the cheapest source of power, but because they carried stories worth remembering. These old millers appreciated this more than they usually admitted, though they might jokingly complain that visitors asked too many questions while standing precisely where serious work ought to be happening. Tourists have possessed remarkable timing throughout history. As another peaceful evening settles across the Netherlands, one elderly windmill continues its familiar rotation. Its sails move slowly against a sky streaked with gold and pale blue. In the distance, a steam pumping station sends a thin ribbon of smoke upward. Neither machine seems in a hurry. For a little while longer, they share the same landscape, the old guardian and the ambitious newcomer. Together, they remind us that history is seldom about one invention defeating another. More often, it is about generations finding room for both, until time quietly decides otherwise. In our final chapter, we'll leave behind the age of industry and journey into the present day, where these remarkable windmills, once built simply to survive, have become cherished symbols of Dutch identity, attracting visitors from around the world, while continuing to whisper their centuries-old stories. To anyone willing to slow down and listen, Part 12. Peaceful ending for sleep well, my friend. We've traveled a very long way together tonight. We began in a landscape that hardly seemed suitable for permanent life, a world of endless marshes, cold winds, shallow lakes, soft ground that swallowed boots with impressive enthusiasm. At first, it appeared that nature had all the advantages. The sea waited patiently. The rivers wandered where they pleased. The marshes stretched endlessly toward the horizon. And yet, generation after generation, ordinary people quietly refused to give up, not through grand battles, not through dramatic speeches, but through careful work repeated every single day. A carpenter shaped another beam, a millwright carved another gear, a farmer strengthened another dike, a child carried another wooden peg across a muddy field, a miller climbed another staircase before sunrise. None of them believed they were changing history. They simply hoped tomorrow's fields would be a little drier than today's. Sometimes that is exactly how civilizations are built, one ordinary morning at a time. Tonight we watched wind become something far more remarkable than moving air. It became a partner, an invisible companion that willingly turned wooden sails, lifted water, protected villages, fed families, and slowly transformed one of Europe's most challenging landscapes into one of its most admired. The great windmills asked for surprisingly little in return. A little maintenance, fresh canvas now and then, occasionally a replacement gear, and of course, a dependable breeze, preferably arriving during business hours, although the wind has always maintained a somewhat flexible interpretation of punctuality. We met the millers, who listened to their machines as though they were old friends, families who built quiet lives inside wooden towers, surrounded by water, children who grew up believing giant turning sails were simply part of the ordinary world, village elders who spent astonishing amounts of time discussing drainage ditches, a subject that somehow became far more interesting than it sounds. We stood beside lonely canals, wrapped in evening fog, heard old stories about wandering lights across the marshes, listened to legends whispered beside warm fireplaces while winter winds rattled ancient shutters. Whether those stories were true hardly mattered. They gave comfort. They taught caution. They reminded people that every landscape deserves its mysteries. Together, we watched entire windmills journey across the countryside, not merely repaired, not rebuilt, moved, beam by beam, canal by canal, patiently following the changing needs of the land. It remains one of history's most wonderfully practical ideas. When the landscape changes, take the windmill with you. We survived fierce North Sea storms, floods that redrew maps, winters that froze canals solid, repairs that demanded extraordinary patience from entirely ordinary people. Again and again, the windmills endured, not because they never failed, because every generation chose to repair them. There is a quiet lesson hidden there. Almost everything worthwhile requires maintenance. Friendships, communities, families, even magnificent engineering. Especially magnificent engineering. Then prosperity arrived. The Dutch Golden Age filled harbors with ships from every corner of the known world. Merchants grew wealthy. Cities expanded. Artists painted broad skies filled with drifting clouds, and graceful windmills standing proudly beside still waters. The mills rarely appeared at the center of those paintings. They did not need to. Their quiet presence spoke loudly enough. Eventually, steam engines entered the story. Coal replaced canvas. Iron challenged oak. Tall chimneys rose beside ancient sails. Progress marched forward with its usual determined pace. Some windmills fell silent. Others survived. A few discovered entirely new purposes. History changed, as it always does. Yet remarkably, the windmills never truly disappeared. Today, many of those old wooden giants still stand across the Netherlands. Some continue pumping water. Others grind grain. Many have become treasured monuments lovingly preserved by skilled volunteers, historians, engineers, and local communities. Visitors from around the world arrive each year to watch their great sails turning slowly against enormous Dutch skies. Children point upward exactly as children did centuries ago. Photographers wait patiently for the perfect evening light. Artists still unpack their easels beside quiet canals. The wind continues blowing. Entire generations have come and gone. Kings have ruled. Republics have risen. Empires have expanded and disappeared. Wars have begun and ended. Technologies have transformed the world beyond recognition. The wind scarcely seems to notice. It simply arrives each morning, moving gently across fields, brushing the reeds, touching the weathered timbers of centuries-old windmills before continuing its endless journey toward the sea. There is something deeply comforting about that. Perhaps it reminds us that not everything needs to move quickly. Modern life often encourages speed, faster journeys, faster conversations, faster decisions, faster everything. The old Dutch windmills suggest another possibility: steady progress, patient craftsmanship, quiet persistence, one careful rotation after another. No hurry, no applause, just faithful work. Imagine for a moment that you are standing beside one of those windmills now. It is late evening. The tourists have gone home. The pathways are empty. The canals reflect a sky painted with soft shades of blue and silver. A light breeze brushes gently across the fields. The sails begin another slow turn. Creak. A pause. Splash. Another quiet pause. Creak. Splash. Nothing urgent asks for your attention. No meetings. No crowded streets. No endless notifications. Only the gentle rhythm of wind and water continuing the same peaceful conversation they have shared for hundreds of years. The reeds sway softly beside the canal. A heron stands perfectly still at the water's edge. Somewhere far away, a church bell quietly marks another passing hour. The sound drifts across the open countryside before fading into silence. The stars appear one by one. Their reflections shimmer faintly upon the calm water. The windmill's silhouette grows darker against the night sky until only the slow movement of its sails remains visible. Even that gradually becomes little more than a shadow. The miller has long since gone to bed. The small candle inside the living quarters has been extinguished. The old machinery continues its patient work, not because anyone is watching, but because that is simply what it has always done. You take one last, slow breath of cool evening air. It carries the faint scent of damp earth, fresh grass, and distant seawater. Everything feels calm. Everything feels unhurried. The marshes that once frightened travelers now rest peacefully beneath the stars. The canals lie quiet. The villages sleep. The wind whispers gently through the sails, just as it has for centuries. And perhaps, somewhere in that endless rhythm, you can almost hear the voices of the countless ordinary people we met throughout tonight's journey. The carpenters, the millwrights, the farmers, the children, the millers who climbed those narrow wooden staircases before dawn, never imagining that people hundreds of years later would still remember their work. History often celebrates emperors and generals, but tonight belonged to quieter heroes, the ones who kept the water moving, the ones who patiently turned marshes into meadows, the ones who understood that lasting change rarely arrives all at once. It arrives one careful turn, one quiet day, one gentle breeze, at a time. So, as the windmill completes another peaceful rotation beneath the Dutch night sky, we'll leave it there, still faithfully watching over the sleeping countryside, exactly as it has done for generations. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey through the marshes, canals, and windmills of the Netherlands. If you enjoyed spending this peaceful evening together, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more relaxing history stories that can accompany your evenings and help you drift gently towards sleep. Until next time, sleep well and let the slow turning of those ancient sails carry you peacefully into pleasant dreams.